Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Our patron Sean is back for another game. He wanted to do something special for his gameplay tonight. He wanted to play a game of no Banlist CEDH. We did this a long while back and it was a lot of fun. We asked him if we wanted to go full throttle cutthroat CEDH with things like Time Vault and Flash. He said he wanted us to flex a different type of muscle. It's so easy to build a Time Vault CEDH deck or a Flash Hulk CEDH deck. So instead tonight, he wanted us to play with what we each thought would be the most fun to play and pilot. So while nothing is off limits per se, he wanted each of us to bring a deck that we thought would be fun to both play and play against. So the Playing with Power team put together some decks and we will see what happens tonight. Time is running out to purchase our playmat. It is available for pre-order only for the month of September. Once September is over, we are fulfilling all orders and then the playmat is gone forever. If you wanted to pick up the playmat, consider signing up to Patreon. Certain tiers get merchandise discounts and you get all kinds of other benefits as well. Check out the links in the description below for the playmat and for Patreon. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Mike piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Thrasios Triton Hero. This deck is all about reanimating Griselbrand from the graveyard and drawing a ton of cards. From there, you set up a line to win the game. Mike's opening hand contains a Dance of the Dead, Time Walk, Spire of Industry, Mox Pearl, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, and a Time Twister. Next, we have Zach piloting Omnath, Locus of Creation with Lutri as the companion. This is a landfall deck trying to grind out value, stacks out the board, and win with a number of land-based combos. Zach's opening hand contains a Command Tower, Lotus Petal, Mox Ruby, Mana Confluence, Mystical Tutor, Drannith Magistrate, and a Time Walk. After that, we have Sean piloting the partner pair of Jeska, Thrice Reborn, and Ishai, Ujatai Dragon Speaker, with Lutri as the companion. This deck is a storm deck looking to resolve Underworld Breach and win the game. Sean's opening hand contains a Jeska's Will, Dramatic Reversal, Island, Imperial Recruiter, Deflecting SWAT, Gemstone Caverns, and an Expedition map. Finally, we have Ryan piloting Arcum Dagsson. This deck seeks to use Arcum's ability to fetch up Paradox Engine and win the game through a combo. Ryan's opening hand contains a Cavern of Souls, Tolarian Academy, Sol Ring, Ornithopter of Paradise, Spellskite, and his London Mulligans are 2 snow-covered islands. Without further ado, let's begin this big bad babbling bounding band of boys. Mike wins the Alpha Flip It or Rip It challenge and gets to start us off. But Sean has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Expedition map. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts a Mox Pearl. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Flooded Strand. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Time Walk. With Mike setting the pace of the game already, Mike moves to his next turn. Mike draws and starts off his turn by floating mana and casting Dramatic Reversal. He casts a Time Twister. Everyone looks at their hands, sighs, and Time Twister resolves. Everyone shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws a fresh 7. Mike plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Rhystic Study. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation, exiling Mental Misstep. Rhystic Study is countered and exiled, and Mike passes the turn. Zach draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Sol Ring. Zach passes. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Sapphire. He casts a Talisman of Progress. He casts a Dragon's Rage Channeler. Sean ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Hurkyl's Recall. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Ryan passes. Mike draws and casts Survival of the Fittest. He activates Survival, discarding Griselbrand, and fetches up a Hapless Researcher into his hand. He casts Animate Dead, targeting Griselbrand. In response, Ryan casts Mana Drain, targeting Animate Dead. In response, Mike casts Force of Will, exiling Hapless Researcher, which was the only blue card in his hand, and paying 1 life. Mana Drain is countered, and Animate Dead resolves. Griselbrand enters the battlefield from the graveyard. Mike pays 7 life and activates Griselbrand. In response, Sean taps his Talisman to cast Swords to Plowshares, targeting Griselbrand. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, and Sean surveils 1, leaving it on top. In response, Mike activates Griselbrand, paying 7 life and drawing 7 cards. He pays an additional 21 life to do it 3 more times, drawing 21 cards. Then Swords to Plowshares resolves, Grizzlebrand is exiled, and Mike gains 7 life. Then the original ability resolves, and Mike draws 7 cards. Mike plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps it to cast Mana Vault. He casts Mox Jet. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts a Soul Ring. He floats mana and casts Dramatic Reversal, untapping his non-land permanents. He casts Silence. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Mike casts Tainted Pact. Tainted Pact resolves, and Mike exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Well, it should come as no surprise that was a pretty fast game. So let's do another, shall we? In this game, Mike brings back Tymna and Thrasios, and his opening hand contains a Tolarian Academy, Bloodstained Mire, Bayou, Pact of Negation, Gifts Ungiven, Mana Vault, and a Mox Diamond. Zach brings back Omnath and Lutri this game, and his opening hand contains a Black Lotus, Misty Rainforest, Mystic Remora, Ancestral Recall, Lavinia Azorius Renegade, Drannith Magistrate, and a Crop Rotation. Sean brings back Jeska, Ishai, and Lutri, and his opening hand contains a Mystical Tutor, Force of Will, Unsubstantiate, Soul Ring, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Steam Vents, and a Plateau. Ryan brings back Arcum Dagsson, and his opening hand contains a Brainstorm, Soul Ring, Lightning Greaves, Felwar Stone, Scalding Tarn, and 2 Snow-Covered Islands. And Zach gets to start us off. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Emerald. He casts a Black Lotus. He cracks his Lotus for 3 blue. He casts a Mystic Remora. In response, Sean casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card from his hand. In response, Zach casts Ancestral Recall. He draws 3 cards, looking for an answer. He does not find it, and Mystic Remora is countered. Zach follows up by casting Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. The entire table groans as that completely shuts down so many cards in their decks. With nothing else, Zach passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Sean passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts a Soul Ring of his own. Ryan passes. Mike draws and plays a Watery Grave, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Vault. Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an island. He casts a Drannith Magistrate. The table groans even harder, and Zach moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Lavinia. Mike takes it, and Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up an Ancestral Recall onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Steam Vents, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his 100% real, non-proxied Ancestral Recall. Can we get a close-up of that real quick? Isn't it beautiful? Sean draws 3 cards and passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He casts a Lightning Greaves. He casts a Felwar Stone. Ryan ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Tolarian Academy. Mike passes. Zach draws and plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts his commander, Omnath, Locus of Creation. It enters and Zach draws a card. Zach moves to combat and attacks Mike with Lavinia and Drannith. Mike takes it, and Zach ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. He pays 3 and puts Lutri into his hand. Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Ryan casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Crashing Drawbridge. He equips his Lightning Greaves onto his Drawbridge. Ryan passes. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool, into play tapped. Staring down the stacks on Zach's board, Mike passes the turn. Zach draws and plays a Temple Garden, into play untapped, paying 2 life. Omnath triggers and Zach gains 4 life. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Omnath, Drannith, and Lavinia. Mike takes it all, and Zach passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. Sean casts Time Walk. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, and Sean surveils Ariok Salvagers into his graveyard. With Time Walk still on the stack, Sean holds priority and casts Lutri, the Spell Chaser. In response, Ryan casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Time Walk. Time Walk is countered, and then Lutri enters the battlefield and its ability fizzles. He attacks Mike with Dragon's Rage Channeler, which now has Delirium, for 3. Mike takes it, and Sean passes the turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Ryan cracks a Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Snow-Covered Island onto the battlefield. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. Mike draws and plays a Bayou. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Zach casts Intuition. In response, Ryan casts Swan Song. Intuition is countered, and Zach creates a 2/2 bird. Then the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain, into play untapped, paying 2 life. Omnath triggers, and Zach gains 4. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Omnath, Drannith, Lavinia, and his bird. Before blocks, Mike flashes in an opposition agent. In response, Zach casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing his Temple Garden. He fetches up a Caracas onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers and Zach adds 4 mana. Then Mike blocks Drannith with opposition agent. Drannith dies and then Mike takes the rest. In his second main phase, Zach pays 3 and puts Lutri into his hand. Zach ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Mystic Remora. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, Sean surveils, and then he leaves it on top. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival. Revival resolves and Zach puts Ancestral Recall onto the top of his library. Then Mystic Remora resolves. Sean casts his commander, Ishai, Ujatai Dragon Speaker. He attacks Mike with Dragon's Rage Channeler. Mike takes it, and Sean passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He looks at Caracas and passes the turn. Mike draws and casts Brainstorm. Ishai and Mystic Remora trigger. Ishai gets a +1/+1 counter, and Sean draws. Then Mike draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays a Bloodstained Mire. With nothing else, Mike ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. Omnath triggers and Zach gains 4 life. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Omnath, Lavinia, and his bird. Mike blocks Lavinia with his opposition agent. Lavinia and Op Agent die, Mike takes the rest, and the table breathes a sigh of relief. In his second main phase, Zach cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers and Zach adds 4 mana. Zach casts Ancestral Recall. Remora triggers, and in response, Zach flashes in Lutri, the Spell Chaser. In response, Sean casts Pyroblast, targeting Ancestral Recall. Recall is countered, Lutri resolves, its ability fizzled, and then Remora resolves and Zach pays for it. Finished up, and a little sad, Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Caracas for turn. Ryan contemplates scooping, and Sean moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Dragon's Rage Channeler. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Sean casts Underworld Breach. Channeler triggers, and Sean surveils Bergi, God of Storytelling, into his graveyard. In response, Mike casts Gifts Ungiven. Mystic Remora triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Sean casts Pact of Negation, targeting Gifts. Channeler triggers, and Sean surveils Mental Misstep into his graveyard. In response, Ryan hard casts Force of Will, targeting Underworld Breach. Remora triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Sean activates Caracas, bouncing Lutri back to his hand. With nothing else, Force of Will counters Underworld Breach, and Pact of Negation counters Gifts Ungiven. Next, Sean casts Arcane Signet. Channeler triggers, and Sean surveils 1, leaving it on top. Sean gives a turn to Ryan. At the end of Sean's turn, Ryan cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Ryan draws and plays in Manamo, School at Water's Edge. He casts his commander, Arcum Dagsson. He moves to equip Arcum with his Lightning Greaves. In response, Zach activates Caracas, bouncing it to Ryan's hand. Then the equip ability fizzles. Next, Ryan casts Arcum Dagsson again. It resolves, and then Ryan equips the Lightning Greaves again. It resolves this time, and then Ryan passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Mike casts Demonic Consultation. Remora triggers, and Sean draws. Consultation resolves, and Mike names Mnemonic Betrayal. He exiles until he hits Betrayal and puts it into his hand. Mike then moves to his turn. During his draw step, Mike takes a damage from his mana vault. He plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He casts a Mnemonic Betrayal. Remora triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor in order to give Sean more cards to interact. Remora triggers, and Sean draws again. Zach then fetches up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Unfortunately, no one has any answers, and Betrayal resolves. Mike then exiles each opponent's graveyard. Mike casts Pyroblast, targeting Remora to keep Sean off of more cards. Remora triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Sean casts Swansong, targeting Pyroblast. Channeler triggers, and in response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Pact of Negation. Swansong is countered, Channeler's trigger resolves, Sean surveils and leaves it on top, and then Pyroblast destroys Mystic Remora. Now freed up, Mike casts Black Lotus. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Dramatic Reversal onto the top of his library. He casts Ancestral Recall, drawing 3 cards. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Mike escapes Demonic Consultation from his graveyard. It resolves, Mike names Glorybringer, and exiles his entire library. Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves, and Mike wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wild pair of games. It was really cool to see some of the brews tonight and what each player brought to a no-band list table. Sure, it would be easy to bring all Flash Hulk and Time Vault, but we wanted to see how other decks might perform. There are a lot of times when you see a regular no ban list game only involving things like Grixis Good Stuff and Flash Hulk decks left and right. We wanted to see decks that had things like Primeval Titan, Channel, Paradox Engine, and the like. It was many of these cards that made us fall in love with Commander in the first place, and it was so much fun playing with them again. Congrats to Mike on both of his wins tonight. What can we say? No ban list is bonkers and you can just win out of nowhere. The constant imminent threat of winning at any time from any player puts a whole new level of strategy to a game. It was a ton of fun. The most valuable card in tonight's first game goes to Griselbrand. Mike's deck revolves around this card, and it's no wonder why. If every card on the ban list was abolished tomorrow, we would immediately advocate for putting Griselbrand back on the list. The most valuable card in tonight's second game goes to Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. There was no doubt when this landed turn 1 that many player strategies suddenly had to pivot. No ban list CEDH is about playing crazy explosive turns, and this card just completely shut that down. A big thanks to Sean for recommending this idea and for being a good sport about letting us bring spicy decks to tonight's no ban list game. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Alright, it's time for Patreon shoutouts. I'd like to give a shout out to Nicholas Tatum, Aaron Mendel, Anton Oberg, Tom Spackman, Salt, Jonas Kofoed, Ryan Wright, Otto Von Trapp, Kvitborn Kong Valamon, however you pronounce that, Nitai Rubinovitz, Ivan, Thumerian Descendant, Frapril, Connor Holtz, Nathan Smith, Pyro, Dark, Mr. Doc, Profolimic Swaggy Pants the Third, Philip Hickey, Jacob Cromer, Brad Tobin, Matt Wingrove, Delph Driz, Chad Hendricks, Dante, Christian L. Sutphin, Ryan Brower, Jared Smith, Rune, Trey Payne, Rakeko, Michael Hallett, Paul M. Toll, Quick Draw, Zods, James Cody Halley, Spencer Raborn, Spiro CZ, Taylor Coran, Darius Mitchell, King O'Sharks, Nick, Liam, Caleb Pretty, Tauntaun 101, Jacob Simpson, and Thomas Bowers. Thank you all very much for your support.